quickly set the stage and turn it over to Jeff, but we've been sort of tracking 3 factors that suggest we should go ahead and do an update to the tenure plan. The first being, I think you have all heard this from us before, but we got more money than was anticipated because of largely the stimulus dollars and the premium from 267. Because of that, we were able to make more progress in our 4-year plan than we thought. So we don't have enough projects in our sort of high priority list to fully commit to the next tranche of Senate Bill 267. So at a minimum, we need to be picking that next set of priorities. The second factor is, of course, the funding, which I just mentioned, and the third being the Senate Bill 260 requirements around creating a greenhouse gas standard. We've talked to CCA quite a bit about that. We're still in the comment period, but that standard, and in fact, the legislation says, Cdot, you must update your plan by October of 2022. Let's see. So just a little context that I think this group knows well. We do have our plan organized into the years 1 through 4, those more projects that we see as shovel ready, and then sort of an out year bucket of projects that would kind of move into the pipeline as we moved along. That's exactly at the point we're now, where we're sort of transitioning from that, accomplishing that final year of the original 4-year to needing to build a next 4-year and then decide if we're going to continue to have a 10-year outlook or not. So what Jeff will run you through is a pretty comprehensive picture at our fiscal story over this entire horizon. And he has it divided into these kind of 3 time periods, looking back on the funding we've received to date, which if you include our enterprises and the money we've been able to leverage there has been about a $750 million a year program, to the next set of 4 years, that next 4-year priority list. We're looking at about $500 million a year, again, with the enterprises, and then a picture for those out years once we're kind of on the other side of the federal infrastructure bill. So with that, I will turn it to Jeff and pick it up here at the end.
There we go. Sorry, muted. Thanks, Rebecca. And as Rebecca mentioned, I think our plan is to come back next week and just to kind of put into context, today we're talking about the 10-year plan. I think my intent next week is to maybe come back and then maybe put the 10-year plan into some broader context of the Cdot base program, but also share kind of something I shared at an earlier meeting with CCA, which is kind of when you're from industry's perspective, when you're talking about Senate Bill 260, Senate Bill 260 goes to a lot of different places and a lot of different purposes. But I would say that probably from a capital construction perspective, where you see most of the Senate Bill 260 dollars going is ultimately to the 10-year plan. And so a lot of that picture, I think you will see just right here as part of the 10-year plan conversation. But then next week I can kind of put it into a little bit more context of some of the other ongoing Cdot revenue streams and other purposes for Senate Bill 260 revenue. So kind of starting out by backing up, the first 4 years of the Cdot 10-year plan roughly corresponded with about fiscal year 19 to fiscal year 22. And colloquially, we've often said it's the SB 267 projects, and that's with good reason, because SB 267 provided the larger amount of the dollars, but actually it was a lot of different funding sources that ultimately came together and were allocated by the commission to 10-year plan projects in the first 4 years. And that included funds provided by Senate Bill 1801, the general fund transfers there. It included the $170 million general fund transfer provided by Senate Bill 260 just this past July. It included a couple of significant supplemental allocations of funds from the TC's reserve fund. And it included some federal coronavirus recovery and relief funds that we allocated, I believe, back in January of this past year. So all those various funding streams came together. They leveraged additional Bridge Enterprise HPTE funds, as well as some local contributions and discretionary grants in advancing that first 4 years of the 10-year plan. Let's go to the next slide, Rebecca. So similarly, looking forward to the next 4 years, the next 4 years would roughly correspond with fiscal year 23 to 26. And they also would draw funding from a variety of sources. First source, 267. We actually have one last tranche of 267 that'll be issued this upcoming spring. And there's more revenue anticipated to be remaining from 267 than we need to finish off the 4-year list. So that last issuance of 267, part of it will go to that finishing off the first 4 years. Part of it will go towards the next 4 years. 260 revenue, obviously 260 passed. We already allocated as part of the first 4 years the upfront general fund transfers, but then there is ongoing revenue to the HUTF and MMOF that we'll be looking to factor into our planning for the 10-year plan over the next 4 years. And then finally, and not least, and pretty significantly, the proposed Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. I'm not going to opine on its prognosis right now, but I will say that we are at this point factoring it into our planning, and the incremental funding we would see through that bill above existing levels is actually the most significant revenue source over the next 4 years that you'll see in this presentation. Take those sources. Similarly, we anticipate those sources would then leverage additional revenue through the enterprises, which would include the new non-attainment enterprise. Let's go on to the next slide. So I'm going to kind of walk through these and each of these sources in brief, and we'll just kind of see them stack up and give us an overall picture of what we think the next 4 years look like from a 10-year plan perspective. We think that when we finish off the fourth tranche of 267, we've got about 380 million remaining on the 4-year list. Take that off, we think we'll still have about 250 million of 267 proceeds that could go to that next 4-year plan. So that's the first source you'll see here, is about 250 million of remaining 267 going to the next 4 years of the 10-year plan. Go ahead to the next slide. The next source is the HUTF revenue provided by Senate Bill 260. I think everybody knows that 260 had multiple different streams, right? There was not only multiple different fees, but multiple different sort of buckets those fees go into. Multimodal Options Fund, Revitalizing Main Streets, local HUTF, green enterprises. The most flexible for us is just the additional increment going into our HUTF revenue stream. Now, we're estimating that over the next 4 years, that's about 130 million that would be available for 10-year plan projects. Now, your initial reaction to that might be, why isn't it more than that? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One, as I think most know, the fees phase in over the course of the decade. So not all of the fees, but many of the fees stair step up. So in the early years, you're seeing the lowest level of fee revenue collection. The second factor is that 260 also included a 3-year reduction to the faster fee. So we lost about $65 million in faster revenue that is essentially has to be offset. The third factor, though, is that we have the Senate Bill 267 debt service, and that was one of the primary purposes of the 260 HUTF revenue stream was to basically give us ongoing stream of funding to pay back the 267 COPs. So actually, over the next 4 years, we're looking at about 740 million of additional HUTF revenue above fiscal year 22 levels, but the majority of that is actually pledged to the 267 debt service, leaving about 130 million available that we would program to 10-year plan projects. Go ahead to the next slide. Another source of 260 revenue, Multimodal Options Fund. The Multimodal Options Fund, the majority of these dollars actually go to locals. 85% of the MMOF dollars supported by 260 ultimately pass through Cdot to locals. We're just looking at the 15% that is directed by Cdot. And over the next 4 years, that 15% is about 50 million that would go towards the 10-year plan and advancing multimodal projects or multimodal elements of highway projects. Next slide, Rebecca. All right, so here we get to the really big dollar amount, but also probably, Rebecca spoke about certainty, and it's like we gain one piece of certainty to trade in for another piece of uncertainty, and the most recent piece of uncertainty is what happens with the next federal transportation bill. The FAST Act expired over a year ago. We're on continuing resolutions. Historically, what we've seen is that there's modest growth through each reauthorization bill and onto the next reauthorization bill, maybe 2% growth a year. This proposed Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is a significant step up. I don't think we take that to mean a permanent step up. I think it's a stimulative step up that will probably go back down, but it's about a $3.9 billion bill. Now, the majority of those dollars aren't new dollars, right? That's our ongoing federal program at base levels, but the increment above FAST Act levels over the next 4 years is about 700 million. Of that 700 million, about 380 is additional flexible revenue to Cdot, meaning the flexible dollars that we historically would have allocated to surface treatment or any of our core base programs. About 90 million is in a new risk and resiliency program, focused specifically, as the name suggests, on projects that address resiliency, redundancy of the system, and about 225 million in a new bridge program. But were the bill to pass, I think our perspective is that we have projects that check all of those boxes in the next several years of the 10-year plan. And so we would direct essentially the incremental federal funding into the 10-year plan. And over 4 years, that's $700 million roughly. Next slide, please. So this is the part where I kind of start to take a few dollars back. So what I mean by that is that, we looked ahead, but we said, we can't really take 100% of the incremental revenue over the next 4 years and assume all of it is going to go out the door to new capital construction projects. We're seeing rising costs, we're seeing inflation, probably most notably in our maintenance programs. So we said we need to consider the fact that over the next 4 years and beyond the next 4 years, but that's the time horizon we're talking about here, we need to preserve some amount of that incremental revenue to basically keep up with inflation and keep up with growing costs in sort of our maintenance and operations portion of our budget. So you take all those sources together, the way it breaks out is roughly, we think about over the next 4 years, about 120 million or so might go back into maintenance and operations and keeping up with escalating costs there. But about $1 billion would be available for 10-year plan projects. Over 4 years, that's an average of about 250 million per year. Now, what that doesn't include, and where I'll kind of go to next, is the enterprises. But that would kind of be the base fiscal constraint of about 250 million a year for 4 years on the Cdot side for the next 4 years of the 10-year plan. Next slide, Rebecca. So I'm going to take a look at the enterprise piece. First piece, the new non-attainment enterprise. Now, obviously, this is a new enterprise. I think we actually have board members, but they haven't met yet. That being said, the new non-attainment enterprise would generate about 40 million over the next 4 years. And those dollars would be available for projects that mitigate air quality impacts in the Front Range non-attainment area. Again, I think we'll have to work with the new board ultimately on those funds, but we think it very likely that the projects that would likely move forward with that are projects that are in the 10-year plan that address air quality impacts in the non-attainment area. Next slide, Rebecca. So HPTE. So in the case of HPTE, and next I'll go to Bridge Enterprise, we're really talking about dollars that are tied to specific projects by and large, right? So in the first 250 million, the way we look at it is sort of formulaically. We look at it across the 4 regions. We say, this is about how much each region gets, and we build out a plan. In the case of HPTE and Bridge Enterprise, it's not quite that simple. It's tied more specifically to projects. So what we did in the case of HPTE is we looked at the next 4 years of the 10-year plan and we said, what are the projects that we think are going to move forward that are going to have a toll-backed financing component, and how much does that total? Well, it's about 325 million. And by and large, that's through the I-70 Floyd Hill, I-270, and a lesser amount of some additional phases on I-25 North. All right, one more slide on the funding sources, I think. So similarly on Bridge and Tunnel Enterprise, we took a similar approach. We didn't assume a certain proportion of revenue that we thought would go to 10-year plan projects. We just looked at what 10-year plan projects do we think will move forward in the next 4 years with the Bridge and Tunnel Enterprise, and what is that total? It's order of magnitude around $500 million. Again, those dollars being tied heavily to Floyd Hill, 270, but also to Vail Pass and some significant investments in EJMT. Let's go on to the next slide. So so kind of bringing this back together, we think that collectively over the next 4 years, between the Cdot revenue and the enterprise revenue, we're probably talking about order of magnitude 2 billion that would be available, breaking down to roughly 450 to 500 million a year, with that split again roughly evenly between Cdot and the enterprises. The other thing I'll add here is that what we're putting together in the tenure plan is a plan, right? So in other words, we will build out 4 years. We'll assume 250 million a year in Cdot funding plus 250 million in enterprise funding. But those projects will then just move forward incrementally as funds become available. Sorry for the kids in the background. The funds, we think the first of those funds that will become available are the funds that would flow this upcoming spring from that final issuance of Senate Bill 267, plus the incremental federal revenue were the federal bill to pass. So I think I've just got a slide or two, and then I'll kick it back to Rebecca because I know we're running down the clock here. We also provided a little bit of a forward look beyond the 4 years, and the levels beyond the next 4 years step down a little bit. And the reason they step down is because we're not assuming we're done with 267, and we're also not assuming that federal levels remain at the elevated level they would be if the infrastructure bill passes. We assume that they kind of step back down to more of a historic level. Were that not the case, great. It would mean a lot more projects. But in the interest of being conservative, we're suggesting that going forward in sort of what we'd call the new out years, we're probably looking at incremental revenue of about an additional 100 million a year through Cdot for 10-year plan projects, plus about the same amount through the enterprises. All right, and then I think this is probably, actually I have one more slide. Rebecca already hit on this. I'm not going to go through all of this, but I will just say that I've got my final slide. If you want to go ahead one more, Rebecca, is kind of what I call the CFO's caveat slide, which is really just kind of reminding folks that there are a lot of variables at play here. We don't know what's going to happen with the federal bill. On the 260 revenue, we do the best we can to estimate, but we have entirely new revenue streams that have no history. That means there's a high margin of error. Could prove to be significantly more, could prove to be significantly less. I'm going to hope for the more, but we'll see. But we think that this at least provides us with a good order of magnitude based on what we know today to kind of plan and build out those next 4 years. So Rebecca, I'll kick it back to you.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. So I'll just close this out with what this means for planning and the next steps before us there. Right now, we're taking a look at those outstanding commitments that Jeff mentioned for the year 4 list, that about 380 million, and just sort of confirming those projects and dollar amounts. And we'll take that information probably to commission just to refresh them on what we kind of have left on our to-do list. And then we'll be kicking off with our planning partners a process to, first and foremost, determine that next set of projects to build a 4-year priority list. Then what sort of remains in those out years. And then I think we'll have a discussion as an agency and with our stakeholders. Do we want to continually have a kind of 10-year plan out ahead of us, which would mean broadening the plan to probably 2032. The schedule for doing that is we're already sort of took the first steps with our commission this month and giving them this presentation that you all just saw. The commission does have some guiding principles I think they'll continue to discuss, but really we're hoping to kick off the first series of conversations with TPRs and MPOs in November, starting with, the good thing about this is we already have projects. We've already built the plan, and now it's really just picking priorities. So this is a lot less of a lift than certainly it was when we built this plan, but we'd like to start the discussions in November, continue at least through the first half of December before the holidays. At that point, the greenhouse gas rule is on schedule. That's the schedule we have for it to be adopted by the commission. So we have certainty then about the greenhouse gas rule. That leads us into early part of the next year, continuing those discussions with the TPRs and MPOs, but also as we head into February, starting to model the plan to see what our compliance is with the greenhouse gas rule, sharing all that information, making any adjustments we need, and then our current schedule would have us positioned to be able to adopt the plan by March, the new updated plan. So I think that is the end of the presentation. If we have time, Tony, I'm sure Jeff and I'd be happy to take a couple questions.
Absolutely. Yeah, great presentation, and thank you for doing that. Any questions from the group? Feel free to type them into the chat or just raise your hand, and you can ask your question. I can start out maybe while people are thinking of their questions. When looking at the revenue sources and trying to track all the different revenue sources, well, one thing for clarification, this is money over and above CDOT's base program, correct?
That's correct. So what we did in each case is essentially look at, for new sources, they're completely new. For others, like the 260 revenue going to HUTF, we're basically looking at incremental revenue above current fiscal year 22 levels. Okay, great. And then, I recall, and I'll have to look it up to get the number, but I recall in the bill that there was an annual general fund commitment specifically for debt service. Yes, that's correct. So the bill provided a annual general fund transfer, but it doesn't start until fiscal year 25. In fiscal year 25, we get an annual general fund transfer, not for the full amount of 267. And it changes, but our full 267 debt service is about 141 million a year. The bill provides for, I think, the first 4 years, it provides 90 million a year, and then it steps down to, I believe, 82.5 million. So, but it does not start until fiscal year 25. So we've got a couple of years where we're covering debt service out of our existing budget and through some upfront funding that was provided by the bill to basically bridge the gap in debt service until those annual general fund transfers start. Great. Other questions? We have a big group here, but don't be shy. If you have a question, please use the raise your hand feature or type it into the chat. It's a lot to digest, and I think, Jeff, you're going to come back again next Monday to try to put it into a little more context of what does this look like? Yeah. In addition to the base program, and then what? Yeah, Tony, like I haven't actually put it together yet, but what I might present. So if you have thoughts from yourself or your membership, please feel free to send those on to me in the next few days. But I thought what I would probably do next week is maybe back up just a little bit, remind folks a little bit about the overall Senate Bill 260 picture, and then sort of overlay that 260 in the 10-year plan with ongoing base CDOT revenues. So you kind of have a full picture of not only what the 10-year plan looks like, but what does that look like relative to sort of our ongoing program. I think that would be really helpful for everyone to just put it into context. Maybe one more question for both of you on the greenhouse gas emission rule. How do you see that coming down in practice when looking at the 10-year plan? How many projects in the 10-year plan will have to go through this process? What are the likely outcomes of going through this process? Is it going to be projects canceled? Is it going to be just redesigning the project to include mitigation? How do you see this working in the real world?
Yeah, great question, Tony, and I'm happy to tackle that one. I definitely see it more in the description you provided there at the latter end that, the standard itself requires that we only analyze regionally significant projects. We'll be working on a kind of a sharper definition of that in the coming weeks and months. Right now, it's a more generic definition we have in the rule. But I can tell you, practically speaking, what we're focused on there are projects that really change the way people travel. So widening interstates, building whole new interchanges. So major sort of investments that affect how people move, not resurfacing, not sort of our bread and butter. So it is a subset of the plan, because the plan includes everything like the Eisenhower Johnson Memorial Tunnel, which is nothing really but a major asset investment and doesn't impact travel. But that being said, Shoshana's been clear in several venues that we still feel like we have a commitment to the tenure list and those projects. So where we expect the sort of change to come from complying with this rule is how do we mitigate and provide sort of additional mobility as part of those projects. I-270 is a great example. There's not really transit along that section of road. Could we look at expanding transit service? What can we do as we look at the I-25 work to better connect to the series of mobility hubs? So it's really adding those elements that would bring us into compliance with the rule. And fortunately, we have funds like the Multimodal Options Fund and the Non-Attainment Fund that are really meant to help pay for those investments. So we'll definitely see as we get into it. We're the first ones out of the door, but I can tell you that's our thinking and approaching this is, and I think largely the tenure plan we have now is a pretty green plan in a lot of ways. It has a lot of focus on assets and state of good repair. It's got a lot of transit and mobility hubs in there. What we need to do is then, take a look at where we have those widening projects like I-270, lesser extent Floyd Hill, just because of the nature of that corridor, but I-25 North, run them through the model and see how we can work to get people having choices in how they move.
Great, thanks, Rebecca.
Sure.
Other questions? There must be some, or any other information that Cdot could provide to help you all in your planning.
Easy crowd today.
Everyone's, yeah. You must have covered it all in your slides. Well, again, Rebecca and Jeff, we really appreciate you taking the time to do this, and thanks everyone for joining us. And we'll look forward to diving a little deeper next Monday.
Sounds good. Thanks for having us, Tony.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. All right. Thanks again.
Okay.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.